I'd first like to thank the library for having me here for this program. It's great to know that even in weird times, people still crave storytelling. My name's Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program of Minnesota's Lumberjack Legends and Lore. So with that, let's begin. So as you heard, my name is Chad Lewis, and although my background is in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years I've been traveling the world in search of the strange, the bizarre, and the unusual. Everything from hunting for mysterious creatures, roadside attractions, weird places, oddities, anomalies, strange people. If you name it, if it's weird and unusual, I've traveled around the globe in search of this strangeness. But it seemed like I was born to eventually cover lumberjack legends and lore. I was born in the city of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which was called Sawdust City because of all the lumber mills that we had in our city. In fact, as a young kid in grade school, I remember going to yearly field trips down to the Paul Bunyan logging camp museum, which sits in Carson Park in Eau Claire, where we learned about the history of Sawdust City and all the logging throughout the Midwest. Once I finished high school, I went off to study psychology at UW-Stout, which was established with money from James Huff Stout, who was a lumber baron in Menominee, Wisconsin. So it seems like all this came together to put me in a great position to talk about Minnesota lumberjack legends and lore. So as we begin, let's set the scene of what exactly was the lumberjack lifestyle and what happened when all these men would go into the woods every winter and then re-emerge in the spring a totally different person. Keep in mind, 1849, let's take a look at Minnesota territory. Had about 51 million acres of land. Over 33 million of those acres were covered with forest. Add in over the 10,000 lakes that Minnesota has, and you can see how much of the territory was covered with forests. And that's when the logging expansion really began to take place. And what we're going to focus today is on the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. This is when logging was at its peak. It's still going today, but nowhere near the day and the level that it once did. Logging was done in the winter, and it was done in the winter for many reasons. First, it was done in the winter so you could avoid all those Minnesota mosquitoes and wood ticks and other animals that were dormant in the winter. It was also much easier to build roads full of ice that your oxen or your horses could haul all the sleighs of trees down to the riverbanks. And there they would wait along the riverbanks until the snow melt of the spring. That would raise the lake or the rivers up high enough where they could shoot all of the logs down the rivers to all those lumber towns along the rivers, including my hometown of Sawdust City. Another reason it was done in the winter is because, believe it or not, a lot of the lumberjacks were farmers. In the spring, they would plant their crops, harvest them in the fall, and then head off into the north woods to make some additional money during the winter when there was no farming to be done. The lodging. Now, the lodging was constructed just for the sole purpose of being the lodge for that season, or maybe 2 seasons if they had enough lumber in the area. They'd often be just disregarded after the lumber camp moved out. They were built close enough to the trees that could then be moved down to the river. All the lumberjacks lived in the bunkhouse. This was the lodging, and it was a pretty cramped lodge. At most, you'd have a little bunk to enjoy yourself. The bunkhouse consisted of all these bunks, and then a door to the outside, and a wood stove with the chimney up, being the only real window or opening in the lodge. So you can imagine the smells that would be in this lodge as dozens and dozens of sweaty, dirty men smoked their pipes at night, chewed the tobacco, and hung their wet wool clothing, the dampness over the fire, their socks, and all their clothing strung about inside the lodge. It's hard to even fathom the smells that must have been going on in those bunkhouses. And the most important place of a lumber camp was that of the cook shanty. This is where the lumberjacks went to eat their meals. And that's all they did in there. In fact, no one was allowed to talk while eating their meals because that interrupted your eating. Your main goal was to cram as much food and calories into your body as you could before going out into the cold for a full day's work. So when you sat down, the cook was the ultimate boss in this area, and you ate as fast as you could. And the cook was very important to the lumber camp. In fact, maybe the most important person in the lumber camp. Many lumberjacks would follow a good cook, regardless of pay differences, fleas, anything else that would happen at a lumber camp. If there was a good cook, the lumberjacks would follow because that was the most important thing for them. For example, their morning breakfast would consist of all kinds of unlimited treats that you wanted. Oatmeal, pancakes, pork, potatoes, dishwater, which was coffee, swamp water, and donuts, donuts, donuts. The reason they had unlimited donuts was the fact that it was cheap to make the donuts. Here's a 1917 logging camp menu suggestion by the U.S. Food Administration, and you can see all kinds of things of cornbread, oatmeal mush, rice pancakes, the famous liver and onions, molasses cookies, and the like. Now let's get to the work that the lumberjacks did. This was grueling work. 6 days a week they would work. Sundays were their only day off, and that would be the day when they would mend a lot of their gear and their clothing. They could also wash their clothes and try to get the lice out of them, or even take a bath once in a while if they so choose. It was also the only time when visitors were allowed on the site. So if you had a family or for a special occasion, perhaps the wife and children would come up to visit you. That was only done on a Sunday, and very rare at that. The lumberjacks would work all day from what they called can't see to can't see. They would be up ready to work before the sun came up, and they'd be working just as the sun went down and they could not see. In fact, they would often announce the day's work as daylight in the swamp, everybody get up. And the lumberjacks were fueled mainly by two things. Not alcohol. Alcohol was usually not allowed inside the lumber camps. The two things that kept the lumberjacks going were coffee and tobacco. They consumed huge portions of both of these. It was also a place where you could get equal pay for equal work. In fact, there were many Native American lumberjacks, African American lumberjacks, and no matter what race or color or religion you came from, as long as you did the job, you were paid exactly the same as somewhere else. In fact, most of the lumber camps were filled with immigrants inside the lumber camps. Old lumberjack legend tells that on any given night, you could hear snoring in the bunkhouse in 9 different languages. We often think of lumberjacks as looking like this: strong, big, strapping, sturdy men. But in fact, keep in mind that in the early 1900s, the average height of an American male was only 5 feet 6 inches in height. In fact, most of the lumberjacks that were operating in the 18 and early 1900s were probably somewhere around 5'3" and 120 pounds. Small considered by today's standards, but they were hardy, strong men who could work all day, and they prided themselves on hard work. In fact, many of them would compete with one another inside the lumber camp to see who could produce the most wood during a day or a week. Even though they got paid the same amount, they took great pride in their hard work. In fact, oftentimes when someone came to camp and decided they weren't going to work very hard, they were often out of that camp very quickly because of all the other lumberjacks. They also wore their clothes a bit different. In fact, they had what were stag pants or stag pans. They would often cut the bottoms of their pants off because while working with snow and ice, the bottoms of your pants would get cold and freeze and wet, and they would be like walking with boards frozen to your legs, so the lumberjacks would simply cut them off. They also looked for warmth, which is why you saw a lot of flannel and wool clothing. And usually it was the type of clothing that you could get at the camp supply store. And this store usually had 1 or maybe 2 different options for you to choose from. Much different than today's wardrobe selection that we have, where you can pick all of your styles. They were at the mercy of whatever the lumber camp decided to carry. All of the lumberjacks had their own pack loaded at all times as well. These were known as their turkeys, and they would keep them packed in case they had to go to another lumber camp, or if they got sick and tired of that lumber work and needed to head out and collect their pay and move on. Horses were used quite a bit in the lumber camps, but it was thought that they were very hard to work with in the fact that they needed a lot of specialty food and a lot of care for in their grooming. Oxen, on the other hand, didn't. They would often eat whatever was around, and they didn't need to be groomed as often as the horses. But what's interesting is one of the legends tells that oftentimes these ox would be left over the winter, and when spring came, they'd simply be left there to fend for themselves until the camp came back the next fall. One of the legends is that any oxen that was left out in the woods would turn into a hodag on its own. We will get to the hodag in just a little bit. Like most people of that era, lumberjacks were very superstitious. In fact, if they walked into a lumber camp and the boards of the lumber camp were running so the ends butted up against the door or the entranceway, lumberjacks refused to enter. They would not want to work there. They wanted the wood to go this way against the main door. One way you could get around this is enter the room backwards, and that would throw off the bad luck of entering it if it was facing you. They also had a disdain for poplar and the poplar tree, which was made up of the cottonwood, aspen, and balsam, and many others. They simply hated to work with it or to be around it. They also did not like wet clothes, but yet they would not change. Imagine the cold, ice and snow melted rivers getting your clothes wet, but they simply refused to change wet clothes. Rather, they would let them dry on them for fear of catching pneumonia. Seems a little odd. You would think it would be the exact opposite. Get out of your wet clothes and get into dry clothes. But part of being a lumberjack was this test of bravery, this proving your manliness at all costs, even sometimes when it cost you your life. Lumberjacks were also superstitious about rabbits. And that's a superstition that continues to this day, that if you see a rabbit and you do not say something nice to it, you'll be cursed with bad luck. So lumberjacks believed that they would always say something nice to a rabbit, even if they were hunting it. Now, this nicety that they had did not transform into that of the infamous jackalope. Luckily, Minnesota and the lumberjacks in the state didn't have to encounter the jackalope many times, as they were more of a western creature out in the plains of the Dakotas, but once in a while they would wander into Minnesota, according to the lumberjacks. And it was a dangerous job. As you can imagine, it was one of the most dangerous jobs anyone could do. Cutting down large trees and then putting them in the water and rolling down on them. Every year, many lumberjacks lost their lives at the lumber camps. Oftentimes, if they were lucky, they would be buried in a barrel, or possibly 2 strips of bark would be used to put them inside and bury them. Oftentimes, they simply were buried on the side of the river or where they met their end in the woods. If they were lucky, they would have their boots thrown up on a tree, nailed to the tree as a grave marker. So if you're ever walking out in the woods and you see boots hanging from a tree, maybe it's the gravesite of a lumberjack. Without a doubt, the most infamous and famous lumberjack of all time was that of Paul Bunyan. Keep in mind, Minnesota claims to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan. But before people in Minnesota get too excited, so do the states of Wisconsin, Maine, Michigan, Vermont, even Canada claims to be the home of Paul Bunyan. What we do know is that the first oral tales about Paul seem to have come from a lumber camp north of Tomahawk, Wisconsin, sometime around 1885, 1886. These were the first oral tales of Paul Bunyan. The first written tale came from a Duluth newspaper called Caught on the Run from the Duluth News Tribune of 1904 in Minnesota. So while Wisconsin can claim to be the first of oral tales, Minnesota can claim to be the first of written tales. And Paul Bunyan wasn't always seen the same way we see him today. In fact, here's an early illustration of what the lumberjacks thought he looked like. Now, I know what you're thinking. You can head up to northern Minnesota today and see people that might resemble this Paul Bunyan. But Paul changed over the years and took on a different look. This was the most popular representation of Paul over the years, as he was mainly used to market and advertise lumber. And we often think of him much different today as the big, strong, strapping Paul Bunyan. But Paul was born, and it was said to be a big event, literally, as he was gigantic. In fact, they still have his cradle in Akeley, Minnesota, where you can go and sit inside and see how gigantic their cradle truly is. Paul Bunyan grew up in Minnesota playing marbles like most kids of that age, except Paul's marble was 9,000 pounds and a sphere of granite, and he would play as he moved around. As Paul got bigger, he had a humongous appetite. There are many legends of him having a skillet so big that his cooks had to strap on pounds of bacon to their feet and use it to ice skate around the skillet, getting the pan greased up to make the flapjacks. Eventually, Paul Bunyan met Babe the Blue Ox. And he met Babe the Blue Ox in the winter of the blue snow. It was a terrible winter, brutally cold. It was so cold that winter. What's that you say? How cold was it? It was so cold that the fish grew fur that winter. Here's a fur-bearing trout from that winter. That's how cold it was. It was so cold that winter. How cold was it? It was so cold that when you were talking to someone at night when the sun went down, your words would freeze in the air. It wouldn't be until the next morning when the sunrise came up that you could have those words defrost and you could hear what your friend was talking about. That's how cold that winter was. And Paul found Babe in the blue snow. He had already turned blue, so Paul took him inside. And like everything in Paul's world, Babe grew to an enormous size. And Babe was a male. Babe went on to marry a cow later in his life. And Paul and Babe became fast friends and lived their lives throughout the United States. Paul and Babe were credited with clearing out North and South Dakota. If you go there and you can't find any trees, you can thank Paul and Babe. They were also responsible for creating Minnesota's 10,000 lakes with their footprints and paw prints all over. You might think this is nothing more than a yarn, but then how do you explain Lake Bemidji, which is in the shape of Paul's giant footprint with his heel? Here's Lake Bemidji, evidence that Paul Bunyan created all the lakes in Minnesota. You can also see his gigantic footprints at the Kohl's department store or clothing store in Baxter, Minnesota. You can see the footprints in Pine River, Minnesota. There used to be boots there, but the boots were destroyed in a tornado. Paul was also an avid outdoorsman. He loved to hunt and fish. In fact, one of his catches, the world's largest walleye, over 2,000 pounds, is on display in Rush City, Minnesota, where Paul was said to have caught it. Paul's bobber was used as a water tower. His anchor is in Ortonville, Minnesota to this very day. And his cup or flashlight, nobody's certain, is up in Paul Bunyan country in Brainerd, Minnesota. His sweetheart is in Hackensack, Minnesota, where Paul Jr. was on the side of her for many years until he left some time ago. One of my favorite stories of Paul Bunyan tells of Paul in a lumber camp in Minnesota. And Paul was terrified of the mosquitoes, the Minnesota state bird. They were so gigantic, they were carrying off many of his men. So he was terrified they were going to clean out his entire lumber camp. So Paul heard of some gigantic bees being down in Texas. So he walked down there to grab these bees so he could bring them up and have them kill the mosquitoes. Here's an illustration providing evidence that Paul brought up these giant bees from Texas to Minnesota. The problem was the bees did not kill Minnesota's mosquitoes. In fact, they mated with them, creating a creature that had a stinger on both ends of it and killed more lumberjacks than the previous mosquitoes did alone. Luckily for those of us who spend time in the Northwoods of Minnesota, these creatures are thought to be nearly extinct, so you don't have to worry about them coming after you. If you head up to Bemidji, Paul Bunyan country, you will see at their welcome center Paul Bunyan's shotgun on display. Paul Bunyan's gun was so powerful and he had such a good aim that he could shoot ducks so high in the sky that the meat spoiled before they hit the ground. It took that long to get to the ground. Paul also was a very smart man. At one point, Paul and his buddies put their logs in the river to send them down to the nearby lumber camp. But after several days, Paul and the crew started noticing the same landmarks over and over and over. That's when they realized they were on a round river going in circles. So Paul dug out the river and created Round Lake in Minnesota. Paul had a bunch of friends as well. He wasn't just there with Babe. One of his friends was Sport, the reversible dog. Paul found Sport when he was just a baby. He was so small that Paul thought he was a rat. So he shot him in half. And then Paul walked over and realized it was a dog and quickly sewed him back together. But in his haste, he sewed him upside down. But this only made Sport the best hunting dog in the world, because Sport would simply chase a creature on its front legs until it got tired, and then flip over on its back legs until it got tired, and then flip over on its front legs, meaning it never got tired and could chase down any animal. Johnny Inkslinger was the accountant at Paul Bunyan's lumber camp. It was said that in 1 week alone, Johnny Inkslinger saved 12 barrels of ink by not crossing his T's or jotting his I's. It was also said that he worked with a split pencil, charging the lumberjacks twice when they came in to buy something. But those who knew Johnny Inkslinger said that was nothing more than bunk shanty talk, that he was an honest man, which is where the origin of the word bunk comes from, meaning not truthful. That story is a bunch of bunk. Brimstone Bill was also with Paul Bunyan. He was the only one who could keep track and keep care of Babe the Blue Ox. But according to legend, Paul and Babe died in 1893. Paul was 99 years old. If you go to Kelleher, Minnesota, you will see the alleged burial ground of Paul here as he's buried outside their park. But I think the death of Paul and Babe might be the greatest yarn of all. Everyone knows Paul and Babe are still out there. Those of us who frequent the Northwoods of the Great Lakes are certain that Paul and Babe will live on forever and ever. But the Lumberjacks believed in a lot of mysterious creatures that science says do not exist. Skeptics say they can't exist, yet the Lumberjacks believed not only did they exist, many of them were deadly. First stop, the Hodag. The Hodag was an invention, or was it, by Eugene Shepard. He was a timber cruiser in 1893, and he spent his time in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. Many say that Gene Shepard was responsible for the creation of Paul Bunyan, which he may have been. But he also said he was out in the woods and he encountered the Hodag, this giant, hideous-looking monster with spikes down his back and rough teeth and claws. Eventually, he said he had captured one of these creatures. He put it on display at circuses and carnivals and county fairs throughout the Midwest. Eventually, it became known as a hoax, that he had his children operating it. He even brought it home and dug a pit for it. And when people found out it was a hoax, more people went to see it, to see how he had hoaxed it, than people had prior to knowing it was a hoax. But Eugene Shepard said, yes, I hoaxed the Hodag, but I hoaxed it because it's real. And it's out there, not just in Wisconsin, but all over the Midwest. And you don't have to travel far to see these Hodags all over the Midwest as well. But don't worry, if the Hodag is still out there, you don't have to worry. Legend is it only eats white bulldogs on Sundays only. Now, many people believe that the Hodag must be extinct. And when they are asked for evidence of that, they point to the fact that we have a lot more white bulldogs here than we have in the past, meaning that the Hodag's not there, cutting down on their numbers. One of my favorite animals of the woods was that of the hoop snake, a snake that was able to grab its own tail and form a hoop and go chasing after you. There were two ways to avoid the hoop snake that lumberjacks seemed to say that worked. One was to jump through the hoop while it was rolling. That would confuse the snake and it would lose its concentration and fall over. The other way to avoid the hoop snake was simply to run uphill and it could not chase after you. Others were terrified of the axe handle hound. These were dogs that were shaped like an axe handle and an axe head. And many lumberjacks who left their axe handle sitting around a lumber camp and it went missing, they blamed it on the axe handle hound that only ate axe handles. It was said that they could eat several cords of wood every winter in the form of an axe handle. I like the Hodag. It was like a moose, but its knees had no knees in it, its limbs, so it couldn't unlock them, and it had long lips almost reaching the ground, meaning that it couldn't lie down to sleep. It had to sit against a tree and march around as though it was in lockstep, walking about. At night, if you heard any trees fall over, it was because this creature was leaning against it to sleep, and its weight pushed it over. This agro-pelter was an interesting creature. It was a monkey-looking creature that would sit in the top of hollowed-out trees and wait for unsuspecting lumberjacks to come by and then smash them on the head with a stick, or they would rip off the arm of a lumberjack and use it to swipe at the next lumberjack. Every year, several lumberjacks lost their lives because they weren't watching out for this sinister creature. You also had to be wary of the splinter cat. It was a cat that would get a full charge or jump and smash head first into a tree, cracking the tree looking for prey. At night, while you were sitting in the bunkhouse, spinning stories with the rest of the lumberjacks, and you heard trees start to crack and sway, that was a telltale sign of the splinter cat. And you had to be very careful of this cat, because if it hit you instead of a tree, it could be deadly. This next creature is one you might smell, you might hear, but you probably won't ever see it because it's called a hide-behind. And just like its name, it likes to hide behind things. Most importantly, you. It is said that if you are standing, it is always behind you. Even if you flip around 180 degrees in a jump, it will still be behind you. It will lurk and grab lumberjacks who obviously cannot see it, and they disappear, never to be seen again. I love the side hill gouger. This was a creature that spent so much time on the side of the hill that one set of its legs were shorter than the other, meaning it could only walk on a hill in one direction and come after you. Otherwise, it would tip over and you could get away. The roperite was another creature known throughout the western portion of the U.S., but also made its way into Minnesota. It would use its long nose as a lasso and lasso unsuspecting lumberjacks that would then disappear, and it would be blamed on the roperite. Now, obviously, many of these creatures are thought to be fake, but I disagree. I think the lumberjacks believed in these creatures, and I think evidenced by the number of lumberjacks that went missing, that these creatures, thankfully, many of them are now extinct or very rare, so your odds of running into them in the Northwoods or the forested area of Minnesota are very slim. But you may want to keep your guitar out just in case that wandering jackalope comes into your campsite while you're enjoying Minnesota. I think one of the reasons lumberjack legends and lore are so popular today is that it's a bygone era. Back in the 1950s, you still had kids who remembered going to the sawmill and playing and watching as their fathers and grandfathers worked at the mills. The idea of men going into the woods all winter long and living in an adult camp of sorts is so foreign to us today. The idea that men, after a long day's work, would just go sit in the bunkhouse and tell tales. And they wouldn't just tell tales like I've talked to you today and spun some yarns. They would often tell a story and then someone would jump in and one-up it, add to the story. So these stories are always progressing, they're morphing, they're moving. They always changed over the years. In fact, some of the best Paul Bunyan stories were never recorded because they were often full of colorful language and they were often sexist. So the reporters that would take them down in the old days would not report them because they were afraid of being fined or being obscene and losing their jobs. So a lot of the earliest Paul Bunyan stories have been lost to history. But I think this is the romance of it. The rose-colored glasses we have of it. Everyone's looking to get up north to explore the Northwoods, the lumber country. And I think that will never die. Just like the jackalope will never die, Paul Bunyan will never die. So hopefully, as you make your way on your summer or winter vacation, you keep an eye out for all of these creatures and legends and superstitions as well. So with that, I wanted to thank everybody for coming again for this program. If you want more information, my website has more than you could ever want or need on the subject of the weird and unusual. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here today with this program. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of Minnesota, and you'll discover that you live in one truly weird state, that adventure is everywhere. You just have to seek it. So with that, keep an eye out, and thank you all for coming.